Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, dear participants. It's a great pleasure to welcome you in the one of the parallel session of the second International Conference on Water, Megacities and Global Change entitled Disaster Risk Reduction 3 out of 3. The session chair is Mr. Nilo Nascimento, who is a professor at Federal University of Minas Gerais in Brazil. Mr. Nascimento, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. As mentioned, we are starting now the session called Disaster Risk Reduction. It is the third one on this topic in the conference. And we have five very nice presentations for today, covering particularly floods and droughts. And we are starting the session with the presentation by Mr. Mohamed Karbouch. And the title of his presentation is Extreme Precipitation and Climate Change at Metropolitan Scale, mapping the historical trajectory of flood risk regimes in Grenoble, Alpes Métropole. I am just giving some information on his bio in French. Il est économiste et doctorant en sciences.
Mr. Karbouch is an economist at the University of Grenoble-Alpes. He belongs also to a multidisciplinary laboratory of social sciences, PACT and Geoscience Institute of Grenoble, and they study the climate sensitivity of the Grenoble metropolis. He is working on a thesis currently on the adapting of the Grenoblois industry for climate change.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. As you have heard, my name is Mohamed Karbouch. I'm a doctor in economic science in the University of Grenoble-Alpes, and I'm working on the adapting of industrialists to climate change in the Grenoble area. And I'd like to talk to you today about some work that I have done with some of my colleagues, Monsieur Brochet, Renaud, and Cretin, on mapping the historical trajectory of flood risk regimes in Grenoble. And I will tell you a little bit more about what we have done here. In this presentation, I would like to begin by trying to explain what the basic problem is that is adapting to climate change. Secondly, I'll move on and tell you a little bit as to why, what is the history that has given rise to our current ideas and our ideas for the future. Then I'll explain our methods, our objectives, the risk regimes that we've been able to identify, and lastly, a few results and conclusions. As an economist, I do my best to work with hydroclimatologists, geographists, politicians, on some of the problems in Grenoble, which is a very complex area. It is a territory where the metropolis is actually cut through by two rivers, Isère, which is called the Snake River because of its sinuous shape. And then also we have a second river as well, and we have some 100 smaller rivers. We have regions, the Chartreuse, the Vercors, and the whole area is shaped like a Y, which is why we call it the Y Grenoblois area. There are 450,000 people who live in this area. We have a very rich and diversified ecosystem with some industrialists as well who are implanted. So we have wondered, more broadly speaking, how would it be possible to come up with sustainable development when confronted with climate change? We based our analysis on the modeling of different risk governance regimes in the Grenoble flatlands since 2019. The risk regime is a simplified representation of configurations that characterize flood risk management, particularly in a context of changing climates. So what we do is we simply define a simplified representation of the different interactions, collaborations, contestations between the actors who have different interests, knowledge, institutional and political weight, and the stakeholders, that's the infrastructure, the policy instruments, regarding the possible management of an environmental risk. The advantage we have with the case of Grenoble is that we have a lot of documentation. We have selected 11 research papers and books covering our research period. I could quote, for example, the work done by Boucheyer on the Drac River, which dates back to 1280, or another, 1925, sorry, or another done by Monsieur Coeur in 2008. We've based ourselves on a series of interviews with people who are working in the planification of the Grenoble metropolis. We have also studied the Drac and the Isère, the two great rivers, because we studied all of the information concerning them. They were the only sources available to us, but we also tried to include some of the other problems that emerge in documents as well. It's a historical and critical analysis. Our objective was to map the different past flood risk regimes, but not only. We have looked at the floods, the Isère flooding or the Drac flooding, or when both of them have flooded at the same time. We've looked at historically documented events, their nature, the consequences at the political level. Was there intervention by the central state? Were there public policy instruments? And we also paused to study the consequences on the social level, inequalities of exposure to flood risk or conflict. The idea behind all of this was to better understand how natural perils could actually change one's relationship to risk, the nature of projects that were done, the finance systems that were set up, and the efficiencies of measures or inequalities of anti-flood protection. And we ended up being able to identify 6 risk regimes that are detailed, that are explained in great detail in the article, but unfortunately I won't have time to go into it in detail today. We focused on how the risks were managed, on the scales of management, the finance systems that were put in place, and the inequalities that were generated in order to better understand how these extreme events could actually change the mechanisms or institutional mechanisms that were in place. And for each regime, we've tried to measure the efficiency of their results. In a nutshell, this is a very simple diagram. We've looked at, we've identified 3 risk regimes giving rise to institutional arrangements based, and afterwards the development of the city is based on these. And then, of course, there are political exchanges giving rise to new configurations and thus new ways of managing extreme risks. We call this a new risk regime, which is different from the previous ones. Next slide. What we can see as emerging results is that the initiator of protection policies has always historically varied between the action done by the communities, led by the residents, or action done by administration. However, we can see that central state action was not always the most efficient, and certainly not always as efficient as action that was put into place by the communities. We saw that some projects were not properly adapted either to the needs or the specificities of certain risks, and sometimes public actions simply stirred up conflict and inequalities between protected areas and so-called non-protected areas. As far as risk culture is concerned, very important, we, between the 17th and the 18th century, saw the setting up of construction of certain constructive policies, the state wishing to take control of governance of flood risk. However, often this public action was based on available financial resources, tax bases, political priorities, and the failures can be displayed with projects that are not complemented or not adapted to needs. And we can see that often in the new risk governance, there is a reticence to want to factor in the elements that are generated by climate change. After modeling these risks, we've been able to validate some current decisions because we had much more hindsight with which to look at the efficiency of these results. We've taken a look at the risks of the Isère, the risk of the Drac. It's been very difficult to actually adapt or to choose which ones are the best adapted to climate change. And in some periods, we saw that political choices that were defined by the severity of the events concerned a particular river. In a period, for example, where it was the Drac that was the most dangerous, giving rise to consecutive flooding in the lowlands. But in other situations, they were problems because of the inequalities of the rivers. Today, what we're trying to tackle is to factor in new emerging problems, which means that risk adaptation becomes more and more complex. Of course, I'm talking about the relationship between protection from the flooding of these two big rivers. We are also very interested we were also very interested to take a look at the contemporary, the interventions of players and their impact in areas such as the industrialists, and how we can better balance between public and private protection and finance mechanism or compensation mechanism, which could perhaps be better correlated to the natural perils that are concerned. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kabush, for this very nice presentation. Questions will be at the end of the session. So I would like to invite people taking part in this session to send questions, please. The next presentation will be given by Mr. Brayton Noll. The title of the presentation is Climate Action is Not Uniformly Motivated, Results from Multinational Survey. Mr. Noll works in the Faculty of Technology, Policy and Management at Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. And Mr. Noll, I would be grateful if you could introduce yourself just at the beginning of your talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Nascimento. Hi, my name is Brayton Noll, and yeah, I'm in the final year of my PhD at TU Delft in the Netherlands. The research that I'll be presenting today is done in collaboration with Professor Dr. Tatiana Filatova, Professor Dr. Ariana Need, and Alessandro Taverna. And I would like to briefly thank the European Research Council for funding both my position and this research today that I will be presenting today. Next slide, please. Thanks. I'm going to be first giving a brief overview of what my lab and I are working on to better contextualize where this research sits. And then the focus of my presentation today will be on climate adaptation motivation, specifically at the household level and more specifically to floods. And so I'm going to be discussing what motivates and what is driving households to take climate adaptive action. And then I will also be discussing the adaptations more specifically, and looking at the connection between the specific household adaptive actions that we measured. And if you guys are interested and want to learn a bit more about what I talk about today, we've had two papers, or one paper recently accepted in Nature Climate Change, titled Contextualizing Cross-National Patterns in Household Climate Adaptation. And then another one that should be out in risk analysis in the coming months or so, titled One and Done, Exploring Linkages Between Household Intended Adaptation to Climate-Induced Floods. So those are good places if you want to learn more. Next slide, please. Thanks. So as you guys are likely all aware, climate change affects all levels of our society, from the macro, meso, and micro level. And then very often, though, these the analysis at these different levels don't share necessarily information with each other or have distinct separate approaches. And so what we're trying to do at our lab is analyze the problem from these different levels, as it is important to do, but also then really promote the sharing of information between the different levels. So we are working with computational general equilibrium models at the macro level to explore country level effects of climate change. At the meso, we're using agent-based methods to look at the interaction between households and firms. And then at the micro level, what I'm focused or primarily focused on and will be presenting to you today, we use surveys and primarily statistical methods to better understand how households are affected and by climate change, and specifically floods, and then what type of actions they're taking. And so today I'll be presenting, or the research I'm presenting today is based on data that we collected back in April 2020. And this was when we launched the first wave of a longitudinal survey in 4 countries across the world with over 6,000 households. We surveyed households in the United States, in the Netherlands, in China, and in Indonesia. And we solicited and traced a number of different questions relating to how these households are experiencing climate change and what type of actions they're taking. Today, I'm going to be primarily presenting on behavioral adaptation and what are the factors that are driving adaptation to floods. Next slide, please. But before I talk about our research and some of our findings, I want to briefly clarify what do I mean when I'm talking about household climate adaptation to floods. And so on our survey, we solicited a total of 18 different measures, excluding insurance, that households could take to reduce their risk to floods. We divided it into 2 groups: high effort measures, where we asked 8 total, and these are we labeled them high effort measures because they're both high resource cost and also a significant financial investment. And these primarily involve structural modifications to one home, such as raising the ground floor or waterproofing the windows. And we also asked 10 low effort measures, and these are things that cost less and don't involve structural modifications to one house, and yet in general require less of a time commitment. And these include things like purchasing sandbags, having an emergency preparedness kit, so generally all around easier to implement. And so in addition to asking what actions households were taking or intending to take, we measured a number of different factors that we theorized would be motivating households to take these different actions. And so we asked households about their threat. So what is their perceived risk? What are the emotions they feel towards flood? Like, are they worried? We also asked households how able they felt to cope, or how able they were, or they felt they were to be able to cope with the flood. So if they felt they could take some measures, could they afford these measures? How effective would the measures be? We asked if they had ever experienced a flood before, and if they had taken any prior action before the surveys. We collected general background and socioeconomic data on them. And then we also asked about their beliefs. Did the households believe that climate change was happening? Did they believe that the government in the country or the county where they were living was doing enough to help mitigate the risks of climate change? And then finally, we asked about with some social and external influences. So were people in their social networks taking climate adaptation? What type of information were they hearing on the media or on social media? And did they trust this information? You can go to the next slide, please. And so each of these different factors we included in a model where we estimated household adaptation intention. And yeah, you'll notice the factors I just discussed are in the bottom right there. And then for each country, we estimated a separate model with the goal being to compare the effects that each of these different factors that I just discussed have on influencing a household's adaptation intention. And so for this, the graphic that I'm showing you right here is just for high effort measures. And there's a almost identical graphic for low effort measures as well that will show some different effects that I don't have time to present on today, but you can see in the paper or yeah, ask me afterwards and I can send it to you. But getting back to my point, we estimated a separate model for each different country with the goal to look at, to compare the effects that each of these factors have on on influencing a household's decision to intend a given action or not. And we were looking for both similarities and differences in these effects to better understand, are households driven to make adaptation decisions the same in different countries, in different contexts. Next slide, please. And so what we found is that in different contexts, there are indeed differences in what is driving households to take certain actions. Excuse me. And so because we only had 4 countries, we weren't able to numerically attribute these differences to, for example, differences in policy, differences in culture, but we investigated the political, the social, and the cultural environment in each country. And then in our paper, we offered our hypotheses as to why we were possibly seeing these differences. In addition to the differences, though, we also noticed a bunch of different similarities. And this was positive for us because it's unlikely that we're going to be able, or the world is going to be able to issue a survey in all the places where climate change will affect or where household adaptation might be necessary. So these similarities offer promise for extrapolating policies and strategies to data scarce regions. And on the previous slide, what was shown was the factors influencing household adaptation intention, but we also looked at the previous actions that households had taken before we issued the survey. And you'll see that on the graphic on the right, China and the Netherlands have taken much less higher effort measures and actually lower effort measures as well than in Indonesia and the USA. And one of the reasons or possible reasons for this is that both China and the Netherlands, or Shanghai and Rotterdam, are city-specific case studies. They experience, in general, less flooding than our case studies in Indonesia and the USA. And also, they have much larger publicly visible adaptation measures that the government has implemented, such as dikes and dams in these countries. So these different contexts might also be reflected in the varying behavior at the household level. Next slide, please. And so in a separate research paper, in addition to looking at the effects that different behavioral drivers can have on household adaptation intention, we were also wanting to better understand the adaptation actions themselves. And both for methodological reasons and just historical reasons, how adaptations have generally been discussed is very independent from one another. And we wanted to understand if that was true. And so in another, in a subsequent paper, we wanted to better understand if household adaptation actions were linked to one another or if they were independent, as is often discussed and modeled. And so instead of grouping the actions together, we, for each of the high effort measures, we modeled them individually. And in set 2, you'll know, we included the number of previously undergone measures that a household had taken. And in set 3, we included the number of additionally intended measures, and in set 4 has both of those. And by going through the sequence of adding in the number of additionally intended actions and the number of undergone actions in our model, we were better able to understand the effects that adaptation actions have on one another. And could you click next, please? Thanks. And so from the, no, please go, thanks. And so from this, what we found is that adaptation actions may not be independent of one another, is often modeled and presumed. And these possible linkages between adaptation actions might affect the speed and scope of household adaptation diffusion. So what I mean by this is that there could exist some tipping points where if a household can be pushed or motivated to intend one measure, it may not require that much more effort for them to intend, for example, 3. So to put it in one sentence plainly, the households that have adapted intend fewer measures, but are more likely to intend a given specific measure. Thank you. Next slide. Thank you. And so in conclusion, what I hope you guys are able to walk away with today is that household adaptation has contextually specific drivers. So when policymakers or governments are wanting to motivate households in their region of interest to take some action to address a natural hazard such as flooding, we want to caution people from just taking copy-pasting a strategy from one region and putting it into another. It's important that you recognize that culture or policy or different environmental contexts can affect how households are making decisions. And finally, and second, that household adaptations might not be independent from one another, and this does have important implications for the speed and scope of household adaptation diffusion. And so we're trying to take both of these findings and bring this into our current work, where we're using the subsequent waves of the surveys that I mentioned in the beginning to better understand how households move from intending an action to actually implementing it. We also, unfortunately, in our case studies, a flood occurred in between some of the waves of our survey. And so we want to understand how experiencing flood impacts household behavior. And then finally, exploring it in multiple levels, exploring the impacts of floods at multiple levels of society. We want to better understand the cumulative impacts of household adaptation with agent-based methods. And you can go to the next slide. Thank you all very much for your attention. And if you have any further questions, yeah, here's how to reach me, or I'm happy to answer them after the session. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Knoll, for this very interesting presentation. So as mentioned, we have part of the session for questions at the end. Thank you. So next speaker will be Mr. Alexis Gattoni Charenzi. He's presenting a paper on using geospatial technology to enhance public participation in disaster mitigation and adaptation policy making. Mr. Alexis is a lecturer and researcher in urban studies. His interest lies in informal settlements upgrading, smart cities, urban governance, disaster management, and property valuation. He has conducted various urban planning consultants for multilateral organizations such as the UN Habitat and the World Bank, working on various issues such as the spatial development framework of Rwanda or the assessment of the performance of Rwanda secondary cities. He also gives lectures in housing policy and economics and real estate finance at the University of Rwanda. So please, Mr. Sebarenzi, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Nascimento. And yeah, thank you for the nice presentation of myself. So I'm going to present, and my presentation kind of is in the same line as the previous presenters, basically looking at the multi-sectoral understanding of disasters, especially floods and landslide. And what I want to do is, next slide, please. Yes, there. So what I want to do basically is informed by the problematic that policy aspirations often lack implementation tools. So when you look at policies, you'll always find, as far as participation is concerned, you'll find very nice aspirations. They are clear, they are in there, that the participation has to be there. But then when you come in practice, sometimes you don't find them because there are lack of tools. And I think in this area, participatory GIS can be of use as a tool. And for that, I take a particular case of a small area in Kigali city called Mazi. And I developed a model, the study developed a model, a geospatial model that can aid in this process of participation. The model is both dynamic and iterative, and doesn't require a high learning curve on the part of the participant, especially the citizen, the disaster affected people. And in the process, I'll discuss the issue of the communication between experts and the citizen and the participants. And at the end, conclusively, I also recommend how the model can be improved to include, especially borrowing from the advances in big data techniques to be more effective. Next slide, please. Now, on the policy level, when one looks at the international scene, as far as disaster risk reduction is concerned, the Sendai framework is kind of the big policy framework, global. And in the Sendai framework, it's clear that the participation is central to the framework. It calls for all society engagement in disaster risk management. And it also encourages the use of the techniques, the geographic information system, and that has to be supplemented by local and traditional knowledge. From this, one gets a feeling that the Sendai framework sets a scene for the participatory GIS. And it is in the same line that, for example, the policies on the level of Rwanda, the national policies, also talk about participation as a core strategy for disaster risk reduction, adaptation, and even mitigation. For example, the National Disaster Management Policy, which is the broad policy for disaster risk in Rwanda, it talks about how the disaster-affected community have traditional knowledge and coping mechanisms that are invaluable in responding to disasters. And even the plan, the National Disaster Management Plan, also calls them the first responders to disasters, which is of course true. They are truly fast respondents to disasters because it happens to them. But then the question is, how are these coping mechanisms, how are these traditional coping mechanisms, how are these positioned as fast responders, how can it be put to the fore when it comes to policy making? And for this, we need a tool. So next slide, please. So the area that we took is part of of Kigali, but perhaps before I introduce you to the area, I want to show you that the next The next level of policy, that is especially the strategy. From the plan, we have the strategy. The strategy are not, the participation is not as prominent in the strategy as it is in the broad policy, which are more high level. For example, the National Contingency Plan for Flood and Landslide only mentions participation, but it mentions it in the context of awareness raising, not so much as a core strategy for policy making, but rather just as a way to make sure that people know about the disasters, rather than intervene in policy making in the act of the disaster. And research, especially in Kigali, has always found that there were this problem of non-participation of people. There is therefore this need of using GIS, not just as a tool for information or location. Actually, although sometimes the experts in GIS are very concerned with the location of, for example, disaster or informal settlement, but for the people concerned, location is not as important because they already know they are affected. Rather, what they want to know is the intervention. What is the solution? What can we do about the disaster is what they are concerned about. So GIS, therefore, has to be part of the solution on that level, not just on the level of location. So next slide, please. So here we are talking of the city of Kigali. The city of Kigali is the primate city of Rwanda. It has half the urbanites, or a little bit more than half the urbanites, actually. And as the whole country, Kigali is also dominated by hills. Its altitude ranges from 1,372 meters to 1,866 meters. So it's hills, therefore prone to disasters, as is the whole country. Disasters, particularly floods and landslide. So the catchment area that is concerned is on the central western part of the city, and it is very densely populated. It is occupied by informal settlement, although this is subject to this nomenclature. This term of informal settlement is always open to debate and contestation, because in Kigali, as it is in Rwanda, generally, people have land tenure, they have digital, their rights are digitally recorded and they have papers, but sometimes they are still called informal settlement. Although they are legally there, they have legal rights. And sometimes the government prefer to use the term unplanned settlement. So there has been a lot of floods in the area. For example, in the year 2020, there were 7 fatalities and 532 houses that were damaged. So the city authority has opted for 2 solutions. There is the solution of moving people from that area and putting them in another place, in another settlement, far away from that place, or densifying the pockets that are safe in the area and making sure that people stay in the area. So those are the 2 policy scenarios that we are exploring here. Next slide, please. So to do this, we have an analytical framework for the model, and the analytical framework has factors and indicators. The factors are drivers of the model, and they are in 3 parts. So we have the triggering factors, the public view factors, and the expert factors. The triggering factors are these factors that are the origin of the policy. These are, in our case, the disaster risk themselves, the floods. So those are triggering factors. And then we have public view factors. These are factors that have to do on how people feel about the disaster themselves. What are their fears? What are their hope? What are their perception about the disasters. And then we have the expert factors. So these are parameters that are put by experts, either from the city authority or from an engineering perspective. So these are things like the master plan regulation or the building density or the topographic nature of the area. So the model has also indicators. These are the things that different scenarios of the models are evaluated against. So this is, for example, the number of people affected, the estimated compensation cost, and the available space. So we use two tools, the ArcGIS with a plugin called CommunityVis. It's a proprietary software, but we hope to have an open source software in the near future from the researchers from the University of Trent. And Kobo Toolbox, it's an open source tool to collect views of the population. Next slide, please. So these are the results. At the end, we find that we have a scenario where people express the kind of vote on what they think is important on the left side, and they give weight to different things. And it is these weight that are translated into maps. So maps are results of what people voted. And on the right side, we have the indicators. So this keeps changing. This is a short in time, but the raison d'etre of the model is that it changes. So when they vote differently, it changes. And when they see the result, they can even change their votes. So that is an iterative and dynamic process. Next slide, please. So from here, we see a number of things. It's that just that the modeling process, first of all, helps us to understand more the population. For instance, in this case, we see a very strong attachment of people to their neighborhood. And this has to do, this is a bit counterintuitive, because in the case of floods, in case of landslide, the intuitive reaction is always to move people. But we have to know that people take the risk of being near the disasters because there's something that their lives depend on that is near that. In this case, it's a market that is near that area, and that's where many people work from. And then we see that the model also helps this conversation between the expert and the citizen. The expert kind of put their thing on the table, the citizen put their thing on the table, and then the model helps them to visually have a dynamic and iterative conversation. At the end of the day, they have a solution that is optimal for both parts. So, and next slide, please. So the model also has challenges. So the first one is the necessity of data. For this to happen, there has to be enough data. For example, in this case, the population really expressed the need to that crime be part of the drivers of where they go and the scenarios. But because we couldn't get the data for the crime, for the criminality in the area, so that was something that was missed in the model. So the model is data dependent, and sometimes data is not as available as one would want. The second is that sometimes the model, if one is not careful, it can replicate the existing discriminatory and exclusionary measures. Of course, in this part, we partly dealt with it by anonymizing the responses, but in a close-knit society like our case study, it's very difficult to anonymize responses, because at the end of the day, people talk and they have a feeling of who did what. And if there is a discriminatory practice, it can be enforced, because the model gives the impression that this is neutral, this is from an expert. So if it said something, it is taken very considerably by the population. So one has to be very intentional to avoid this thing, this discriminatory process. And we also see that in the future, it would be very key, it would be very important to enrich the model by bringing in, for example, big data analytics. Next slide, please. So as a conclusion, we see that there is a need for tools as we make policy, as we have good aspiration from high-level policies. These need to be translated in reality, and for this, there is need for tools, and GIS can be one of those tools. It needs to take a whole view, not just location, but also as intervention and having in mind the social and economic elements. And we also recommend that in the future, it would be good for this model to be enriched by big data analytics from, for example, satellite images or from social media to collect more views and diverse views. So thank you. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Sebarenzi, for this very nice presentation. And we are now moving to the fourth presentation. Professor Jacques Ganoulis is not available in the session, so we will play the video of his presentation. The topic is increasing hydro resilience to climate change, the case of Athens Metropolitan. And Dr. Ganoulis is Emeritus Professor of Civil Engineering at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki in Greece. He has a doctorate d'etat in nature sciences from the University of Toulouse in France, and he acts as visiting scholar in different universities, Melbourne, Paris 6, and other McGill and other universities. He is ex-State Secretary for Water in Athens, Greece, and Director of the UNESCO Chair International Network of Water Environment Centers for the Balkans, and Senior Consultant and Greece representative in UNESCO's International Hydrological Program. So I would be grateful if someone could please play his presentation.
Good morning, everyone, or good evening, whatever you are. I'm Professor Jacques Ganoulis, sitting in Thessaloniki, Greece, in order to present you a case study of flood protection in the case of Athens, the capital city of Greece. I will share my screen for you, and I will put in full screen mode in order to be able to make this presentation. And summarizing, I will start by presenting the current situation briefly, some hydrological elements. Of course, the risk of flooding in the area due to climate change, this risk has been increased. And I will conclude for the need of more cooperation between municipalities which are located in the area of Athens Metropolitan. This is very important. And this presentation is based in two papers recently published. The one is about, the first one is about a case study, more general about a model for sustainable hydro governance. And the second one is included in a UNESCO publication to be published next year about the Attica Metropolitan case study, which is a wider area than Athens Metropolitan. So what is the particular situation for the capital city of Athens. It's a kind of natural floodplain located in the southeastern corner of Greece, surrounded by 5 different mountains: Imitos, Pendeli, Parnitha, Pikilo, Oros, Egaleo. And the amount of water every year by precipitation is not so important. For example, we can get about 2 meters of precipitated water in northern western Greece, and in this area, it's only 400 millimeters per year. The geology of the plain is karst, which means a lot of surface water goes underground. This creates a lot of springs for drinking water. There are not big rivers for creating floods, but streams which are near the center of the city. This has been covered due to intensive urbanization. But at ancient times, these were green areas, and the plain near the center is a fertile plain where vineyards and olive trees have been planted. And the access of the sea to the sea by the Piraeus port is one important element to choose this place for the capital city. But what is the main, characteristic is the relation between the urban situation and water. And we can see here the water cycle in the coastal city, which can be Athens and Piraeus, which can be divided in 2 parts: the marine cycle and the land cycle, land precipitation. And of course, there is not enough water to sustain life and ecosystem. So why the people at ancient times decided to create the city? This is explained by a myth. The Athenians at ancient times called 2 gods, Poseidon and Athena. These 2 gods can be seen at the Acropolis Museum. It's part of the fronton of Parthenon in the Acropolis. And they asked the 2 gods what could be offered to the city in order to be recognized as patron, a patron of the city. And Poseidon used his triumph, offered a spring in the rock of Parthenon, of Acropolis, and Athena offered the wisdom and also an olive tree. And Athenians opted for the wisdom and the olive than to limited spring water of Poseidon, and they named the city after Athena. So the ancient situation around Acropolis with 2 main rivers, Kephissos and Ilissos, has been modified by intensive urbanization in recent times, where we can see the disappearance of these rivers by a lot of streets and boulevards. And this has increased the risk of flooding because not enough water goes underground. Many of these impermeable areas create the circumstances for creating floods. So according to the European legislation, Greece is part of this, union. There are management plans to be created, and this has been the case for 2019. The Attica Peninsula, where Athens is located, is one of the districts where these management plans are developed. And the program of measures can help to mitigate floods. But even with this planning, there are still problems in the area. For example, one of the results of this planning is to locate areas of high risk near the Kifissos River and low risk near the Ilissos. But still, because also of the climate change, in 2017, in the Mandra local area, there were catastrophic flood who resulted to about 20 victims of loss of human lives. So there is an important effort to do in order to mitigate these floods in the urban area. And one of the findings of this study is the cooperation or lack of cooperation between municipalities in the area. Every municipality has his own, say, technical service, and they have local protection measures, they take measures. And sometimes they propagate floods downstream to another municipality. So governance issues, how to share responsibilities, and the need of coordination is one of the important elements in the area. As a conclusions, we can see that the flooding risk in big modern cities is mainly due to increasing urbanization. And if we want to increase resilience, then we have to first restore historical riverbeds or rivers across the city, and also to have a kind of responsible body to deal with floods independently of local borders and administrative borders like the community. So increase of coordination is one of the main elements of the future study. And what is ongoing is to promote a dialectical model for conflict resolution between stakeholders. This is important also to reduce floods and to involve also citizens in water monitoring. And by the end, a multi-level hydro governance for flood mitigation is under development. Thank you, and I hope we'll have the time for some questions and some discussion after this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ganoulis, for your very interesting presentation. I suppose that questions can be sent to you by email, and so the debate can, in a certain way, be take place. The next presentation will be given by Ms. Karina Simone Sass. The title of the presentation is Economic Impacts of Droughts, an Analysis for the São Paulo Metropolitan Area. And Ms. Sass is economist and PhD in development economics. She's member of the University of São Paulo Regional and Urban Economics Lab. Her studies have an emphasis on regional and urban economics, impact assessment, and economics of climate change. So, Ms. Sass, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Nascimento, for the introduction. Good morning, everyone who's watching this presentation. I'm going to show you some piece of the work I did in my PhD thesis. The presentation is about the economic impacts of drought in the São Paulo Metropolitan Area. Next slide, please. So why we should study the economic impacts of drought? This climatic extreme can cause several impacts on cities, and it is supposed to become more frequent and intense because of climate change. Despite of that, not much is known about the effects of drought on economic activities developing in cities, and especially in large metropolitan areas. And this can difficult the identification of the vulnerabilities and the proposal of the adaptation strategies. So here lies the main contribution of the work. It is to estimate such impacts. Next slide. The study concentrated in the São Paulo Metropolitan Area. Go back, please. The study concentrated in the São Paulo Metropolitan Area because it is the most dynamic and populous city in Brazil and South America. The region comprehended 39 municipalities that together accounted for 70% of the Brazilian GDP and 10% of the population. This is a region that constantly is faced by drought. So this extremely represents a risk to the economic development of the municipalities. Next slide. To estimate the impacts of drought in the economic activities in the São Paulo Metropolitan Area, I proposed a system able to capture the channels represented in this figure. A drought can affect water availability and water quality, and also the factor productivity, which are the productivity of workers and the capital like machinery, and also affect the provision of inputs necessary to the production of a specific industry. And because of that, the cost of production can arise and can even happen stoppages in the production line. This is what I call the direct impacts of drought. This direct impact in a specific industry, it can spread to other economic activities and regions due to the production linkages. And these effects of these linkages is what I call the economy-wide effects. Next slide, please. This estimation I did comprehended 3 steps. The first, I selected a variable to represent drought conditions. And then I used this variable to estimate the direct impacts that I already told you. And finally, I performed simulations to analyze how these direct impacts propagated in the entire economy. Next slide, please. Here are more details about the methodology I use. About the source of data, the first one is a variable to represent the drought condition that I calculated using the self-calibrated Palmer Drought Severity Index, which are the SCPDSE. The second source of data is the historical record of municipal industry production for 21 industry. unless there is an interregional input-output matrix with data from 56 sectors and 41 regions. All this data I use in two models. One is an econometric specification that estimated the direct impacts. And the second model is a spatial general computable equilibrium model. This kind of model is a representation of all economic relationships in a given region. And when I perform simulation, it show me how the economic variables, for example, the total production, consumption, in all the sectors, activities are affected by an exogenous shock caused, for example, by a drought. Next slide, please. Here I'm going to show like a brief of the results. I identify that these 10 sectors may have this production affected directly by a drought. Next, please. Among them, there are a group that is water and energy intensive sectors, like petroleum derivatives, metallurgy, metal products, electric and mechanical machines. And these are industries with high backward and forward linkages. So disturbance in its production have the potential to affect all other economic sectors in the São Paulo metropolitan area. As policy suggestions for all these sectors which are negatively affected by drought, it is to investment in technology to reduce the use of resources like water and energy, increase their productivity. At the same time, they're investing in decarbonization and take advantage of green financial instruments. Next slide, please. About the economy-wide effects, a general equilibrium model give me thousands of variations. So I just summarize the most important ones. The simulation shows that the biggest indirect effects, which are the ones caused by the economic linkages, are the sectors related to infrastructure, like real estate and rental leasing, construction and public utilities, and personal service. These sectors are affected because when industrial production falls, they demand less from other sectors and decrease the income paid by the workers, and the workers spending less. In this, all summing up, give me the regional impacts. In all the municipalities represented in the model can have falls in their gross regional product, in disposable income and consumption. In monetary terms, the losses can reach more than $1 billion, like only in the São Paulo metropolitan area. As a possible policy suggestion for the municipalities in this area is to invest in green sectors to reduce the damage from the traditional sector's vulnerability, and to turn like the cities more sustainable. Next slide, please. As preliminary conclusions, now because I still working on some of the results and performing like more tests, I pointed that in a large urban area like the São Paulo metropolitan area, a drought can affect mainly the capital intensive sectors. And this can be a problem for the economic development, because these are the sectors that represent the most advanced technology in the area and also in the country. To face these vulnerabilities are necessary investment in technologies. Otherwise, the local economies can suffer the negative consequences like job losses, in the falls in economy. The work also shows the necessity to include sectorial vulnerabilities and indirect effects of streams like droughts in local vulnerability assessment and adaptation strategies. Because like this indirect impacts can reach in terms of in economic terms a higher impact than the directed one. So then the directed one and can also reach the entire economy. Next slide, please. So this is what I have to show you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Karina, to bring drought to this panel as well. We are now going to the question and debate part of the session. And let's see, we have some questions. We have a first question to Mr. Alexis Sebarenzi. The question comes from Mr. Regis Tepo. The Rwanda presentation was very much interesting and exciting. Can you precise how the results of this participatory process are used by the local authorities, please?
Thank you very much. Yes, so the model itself, the idea of the model is that the results are arrived at simultaneously. So the authorities and the disaster affected people go in a process where the results are kind of shared. So the result, it's not like the results are done by the model and then presented to the authority to do something about it. It's rather that it is together. So the model, that's the idea of the model. In terms of realistically what happened in Kigali, it is still a process. So yeah, it is still a process. They haven't really taken up the process to use it in the further exercises, but that's the hope. The hope is that once the model is presented and they use it, they will be able to arrive at the result together, the authority and the people together. But at the moment, they haven't used it yet. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a question to Professor Jacques Ganoulis from Maxime Guziev. I'll just read the question, but of course, this will be answered by email in the next future, I guess. Thank you very much for the very interesting session. And I have a question to Jacques Ganoulis about the possibility of artificial floodwater recharge to the karst aquifer. This may be a viable technical solution to go first while trying achieving collaboration among municipalities. So just we'll leave this question for the near future. And there is also a question to Ms. Sass from Sushari Kuntanakuvong. I'm sorry for not pronouncing it well. Do you have some figures of drought damage?
Hello, thank you for the question. I have figures identifying the drought events, and I put these figures in the paper. I identify like the historical record and analyze the climate projections. I didn't use it in the presentation because of the time, but about the damage, like economists usually work more with numbers than showing the figures. But in the text, in the paper, I have like all the data that base my presentation.
Perfect, thank you. So we don't have other questions from the public, but I have some questions perhaps to address to the other speakers. First one to Mr. Cambucci. Could you please talk a little bit about how in time this knowledge of floods, 800 years of information and knowledge about floods in Grenoble, how this reflected on the urban planning? Is something that is clearly taken into account in time?
Concernant cette question.
Yes, for this question, well, the historical knowledge is very important because it makes it possible for you to draw some lessons from the past and from history. What we have noted is that in the current documents, well, we really draw the lessons from what was seen in past buildings, etc. But it's also the case for inequalities as to the protection. We have seen over time that sometimes some neighborhoods were better protected than other neighborhoods. Some neighborhoods were sometimes sacrificed, so to say, but now we have a place which is highly urbanized, so every place is protected. So this historical knowledge was used to make sure that there was equal protection of all the areas. And in this context of climate change, we have some new uncertainties, so we need to consider also some historical background and knowledge so as to design the strategy of protection for the future. Thank you very much.
I will then ask I have a question to Mr. Knoll. Actually, two questions. The first one, you focused mainly on household adaptation. I would like to ask you about the community organization, self-organization to flood fighting. If you could also observe these initiatives by the community in flood fighting. And another point is more on the financial aspect. Who is funding the household adaptations in the different countries? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. To first address your community adaptation question, that's a really good one. And there's a ton of interesting research out there that we draw upon a little bit. Wilson and some of her colleagues I know have been publishing a lot on this. We mainly focus on household adaptation in this paper, but we do discuss in our discussion and future work section the potential to link this to like joint adaptation or more community level adaptation. But for the analysis that I presented today, it's mainly at the individual or household level. And then in terms of financing, the households are primarily responsible for financing this or financing the household level actions. But it is one of the largest inhibitors that we saw. The perceived costs of a given measure is one of the, or plays the largest role in deterring households from taking actions. And so one of the strategies we recommend to governments or policymakers that really want to promote household level action, in addition to whatever strategies they're taking at the public level, is to offer subsidies, is to help support financially households in making or in undertaking these adaptations.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another question from Mr. Maxim Guzeyev. The question is to Mr. Noll. Thank you very much for a very sharp presentation, and it was interesting to see the cost-country comparison. Did you take into account differences between developed and developing countries?
Hi, Mascom. Thanks. That's a really good question. We did, and we do discuss this a little bit. The United States and the Netherlands, of course, are more or economically richer per capita than China and Indonesia. And so we do discuss a little bit of a global north, global south divide. But with only 4 countries, it's really difficult to draw conclusions on that. And in the field of household climate adaptation, and specifically to floods, emerging economies are research in emerging economies is underrepresented compared to research in Europe and North America. So I think it's a really important issue that there are probably differences that exist that our research may be touched on, but hopefully future work can go deeper into that issue.
Okay, thank you very much. And finally, probably a question to Ms. Karina Sass, making the link between drought and floods in this session. Do you believe the general equilibrium model can be easily utilized for flood damage assessment at the metropolitan scale, for instance? And what can be the possible difficulties in using this model in this particular context? I'm considering that the duration of floods may be much lower than droughts, although, of course, the impacts may propagate for several months and even years, depending on the flood. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Professor Nascimento. Yes, that is possible to use this general equilibrium model to assess the economic impacts also of floods. Actually, there is like a work made by Professor Eduardo Haddad, who was my advisor in PhD thesis, where he did this again for the São Paulo metropolitan area. And he did an integrated analysis, like similar to what I show you. First, he assessed all the direct impacts of floods in the São Paulo city, and then used this assessment as a shock in the general equilibrium model. So the main difficulty will be to estimate these direct impacts. For example, a flood, you have like combined with this information, see where the floods is, which part of the city are being affected, are this area residential or industrial, because they will be difficult. So I think this is the most difficult thing.
Thank you very much. And Maxime Gouzayev, thanks very much, Mr. Noll, for the comprehensive answer of the question. Okay. So we are coming to the end of this session. I think it was really a very, very interesting session. Papers are quite connected. We could explore aspects on historical perspectives of floods, different approaches in adaptation, local scale, metropolitan scale, floods and landslides, the discussion on using GIS tools, and going beyond risk awareness to a more comprehensive flood and landslide risk management. We also discussed about the need of governance, in particular of coordination at territorial scale, from municipal to metropolitan scale, on increasing resilience to climate change and on flood management in general. And finally, on the issues regarding impacts of droughts on the economic activities and how this propagate in a metropolitan scale as well. So I think we are in the core of the topics discussed in the conference, and this all the presentations are very nice contributions to this discussion. I would like to thank all the speakers for very, very well organized presentations, direct to the point, and keeping the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Nascimento, and all speakers for the very interesting presentation. Thank you, dear participants, for your attention and interest. Stay online. 3 more parallel sessions will start at 11 to discuss governance modalities, strengthening of sustainable. Very much.
Notre époque connaît des changements sans précédent. L'activité humaine augmente, les villes s'étendent. Aujourd'hui, plus que jamais, l'eau a besoin de nous. Le traitement de l'eau, c'est notre responsabilité. Une histoire d'hommes, de femmes, faite d'engagement et de savoir-faire. C'est notre histoire au SIAAP. Nous collectons, transportons et dépolluons les eaux usées de 9 millions de franciliens. Notre réseau de 440 km de canalisation est géré en temps réel, avec des outils de prévision et de régulation qui nous permettent d'anticiper toutes les situations et d'optimiser la gestion des flux. 7 jours sur 7, 24 heures sur 24. Chaque jour, dans nos usines, nous traitons 2,5 millions de mètres cubes d'eau usée. Grâce à un savoir-faire et des équipements uniques en Europe. Notre vision est durable, tournée vers le long terme. Nous nous engageons à développer notre activité industrielle de manière responsable. Nous investissons régulièrement dans la modernisation de nos usines et dans le développement de solutions innovantes et protectrices de l'environnement. Chacun de nous, dans son métier, se sent porteur du service public et de l'intérêt général, au service de notre mission, la préservation du milieu naturel et de la biodiversité. Au SIAAP, nous sommes fiers d'être une entreprise publique forte de 40 ans d'expérience au service de l'agglomération parisienne. Et nous sommes plus de 1700 agents à partager cet engagement et cette passion. Pour aujourd'hui et pour demain.